Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. Welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Last episode, we dove into the chaotic, violent, creative world of the 17th century British colonies. We saw how the labor systems were vague in those early years, but then they hardened into brutal, race-based chattel slavery, and that would become the defining feature of America. We watched as turmoil in Britain, the Civil War, the execution of a king, and revolution sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, and it forced the colonists to question their relationship with the mother country. And we witnessed the century of riot and rebellion, from King Philip's War to Bacon's Rebellion, conflicts that reshaped the colonial landscape and forged new, often brutal, social orders. Today, we move on into the 18th century. And if the 17th century was about survival and settlement, the 18th century, the 1700s, was about something else: the maturing of the American colonies. By the mid-1700s, a distinctly American culture was taking shape. But here's the great paradox of the era. At the very same time that the colonies were becoming more American in that sense, they were also becoming more British. It's a contradiction that we're going to have to unravel. So how is that possible? Well, it happened through a series of revolutions. Not the revolutions of guns and soldiers, but the revolution of ideas, of goods, and gods. A consumer revolution tied the colonists to Britain through a shared love of cultural things like tea, textiles, and for some reason, mahogany furniture. A religious revolution also tied us back, with the Great Awakening, which swept through the colonies, creating a shared evangelical experience that transcended colonial boundaries. And a political revolution happened as well, and it was brewing in the colonial assemblies, where colonists first began to assert their rights as free-born Englishmen, even after generations of living across the ocean. But all of this dynamic, growing, increasingly complex colonial society was about to be thrown into a global war for empire, a war that, in the end, would force Americans to decide once and for all who they really were. So let's go. To understand the 18th century, and especially in the colonies, we have to start in a parlor, not in a church, not in a legislature, but in a parlor. Because in the parlor, among the teacups and that mahogany furniture, a profound change was taking place. This is what historians call the Consumer Revolution. Thanks to improvements in manufacturing and transportation, and especially the growing availability of purchasing on credit, British consumer goods flooded across the ocean into American colonies. Things that had once been luxuries because of distance and cost of shipping, like sugar, tea, fine textiles, mahogany furniture, these became common goods. These colonists, who had once made most of their own tools and clothes out of necessity, now could increasingly buy them because of how quickly and cheaply they could be brought to the colonies. This created a powerful, tangible link back to England. Drinking tea from an English-made cup, wearing English-style clothes made in England, or even sitting on a chair made of imported mahogany wood from England, were all ways of participating in a shared British culture. This desire to emulate British style was most visible among the colonial elites and gentry, that wealthy planter class, especially in the South, as well as the merchant elites in the North. These would who we would be referring to as the gentry. And the gentry wanted to act genteel, which meant to be refined, to be free of the rudeness of the common people. And the gentry then modeled themselves on the English aristocracy and elites. They built grand mansions, they often lived on hilltops to dominate the landscape, and they filled these mansions with imported goods to advertise their status and power. Only a truly rich person would have English mahogany wood furniture imported directly from England, or the latest crazes as soon as they came out, the keeping up with the Joneses idea. So we can get a fascinating glimpse then into these homes of the rich and the genteel through the probate inventories. A probate inventory was a detailed list of possessions that a person had that they had to give at their death, so that way a will could be then distributing those goods and so forth. So let's take the inventory of a man named William Trent. He was a wealthy merchant who died in 1724. His house was filled with items that signaled his status. Quote, 2 large pier glasses with sol-popped shells gilt with gold, end quote. There were also numerous kitchen implements suggesting lavish entertainment and a large supply of table silver. But this consumer frenzy wasn't just for the elite. The availability of credit allowed families of just even modern and modest means to purchase items once reserved only for the wealthy. A farmer might own a single silver teaspoon or a set of teacups, small in our eyes maybe, but it was significant symbols of their aspirations to gentility. This cheap consumption allowed colonists to feel connected to the trends and the tastes of the British Empire. Remember, to consume something is not simply just to eat something, that is one way to consume, but to actually use a good is to consume that good, to purchase it and to use it, like a screwdriver, for instance. So the Consumer Revolution was a double-edged sword. It bound the colonies closer to Britain through this shared material culture, but it also created economic tensions and a system of debt that would have major political consequences. When Britain later tried to tax these very goods that they were hooking their American colonists on, sugar, paper, tea, the colonists would use their power as consumers as a political weapon, organizing boycotts and non-importation agreements that struck at the very heart of the imperial economy. But more on that in a few. This bustling Atlantic economy, with its ships full of mahogany wood and tea, was built on a foundation of unimaginable brutality, because of course it was. The most lucrative exchange of all the goods crossing the Atlantic was the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade, which reached its peak in the 18th century. The journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, still remains one of the most horrific chapters in human history. And we have powerful first-hand accounts of this, like we talked about last episode, like Olaudah Equiano, who was kidnapped, if you forget, from his home in West Africa as a boy and forced aboard a slave ship. This system fed the insatiable demand for labor, and the colonies' labor demands, especially in the South, only grew as cash crops intensified. In South Carolina, a black majority emerged, toiling on the vast rice and indigo plantations. The ever-present fear of this enslaved population, which greatly outnumbered whites, led to ever harsher slave codes to make something of a rebellion impossible. But it didn't stop rebellions, it just made them more violent. In the Stono Rebellion of 1739, the largest slave uprising in the mainland colonies, this event sent a shockwave of terror through the white population. Led by an Angolan named Jemmy, a group of about 20 enslaved people broke into a store, they seized weapons, and they marched south from just outside what today would be Charleston towards Spanish Florida, where they had been promised their freedom. Their numbers swelled to nearly 100 as they marched with banners crying liberty. The rebellion was brutally crushed by the colonial militia. In its wake, South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, one of the most comprehensive slave codes in North America. It made it illegal for slave people to assemble in groups, illegal to earn money, to grow their own food, or to learn to read and write, all things that they think contributed to the 1739 Stono Rebellion. We had talked about last episode of just how important it was to create laws to solidify race and slavery into one, but that only created more problems. As I said, resistance never went away. Resistance was a continuous feature of the slave system, but the legal frameworks designed by the different colonies were designed to crush any hope of a future successful resistance to the system. And yet, even as the institution of slavery became more entrenched, more codified, and more violent, more brutal, the first stirrings of an organized anti-slavery movement began to emerge in the colonies. The earliest and most persistent voices against slavery came from the Quakers. As early as 1688, a group of Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, issued a remarkable petition against slavery. And it is one of the first documents in American history to argue for universal human rights, something I talked about last episode. The Germantown position, as I said, was a radical petition for its time. The Quaker leadership, finding the matter so weighty, to use their words, effectively tabled it. But the seed had been planted, and throughout the 18th century, Quaker activists like John Woolman and Anthony Benezet continued to agitate against slavery. And in 1775, Quakers helped organize the first abolitionist society in Philadelphia. This growing moral unease with slavery existing alongside the colony's deep economic dependence on it, creating a profound and enduring contradiction at the heart of American society. And spoiler alert, it would eventually lead the society on the path to civil war. It's one of the great contradictions of these United States. The same time as colonists were wrestling with the contradictions of slavery and codifying it, making it more brutal, more violent, more entrenched, they were also engaging in other debates, passionate debates, about the nature of freedom. It's a contradiction. But this freedom, whether it was political, religious, or individual, was a very important debate in the 18th century. Two movements were central to this evolving debate about freedom. The rise of colonial assemblies, allowing colonialists to have their own voices and political autonomy, as well as the religious revival known as the Great Awakening. So throughout the 18th century, a quiet power struggle was playing out in every colonial capital, all of them. On one side were the royal governors. These were men appointed by the king and tasked with enforcing British policy across the ocean. On the other hand were these colonial assemblies. They differed in each colony, but they all pretty much did the same sort of thing. They elected property-owning colonists, and they were fiercely protective of their local autonomy. So you can see how this would be a power struggle between the king's representative and those living on the ground. These assemblies saw themselves as little versions of the parliament back home in England, and they felt that they had the right to control local matters like taxation and spending, what's known as, well, what we would call the power of the purse. They used this power to check the authority of the governor, sometimes even withholding a governor's salary to get their way. A pivotal moment in this struggle for liberty came in 1735 with the trial of John Peter Zenger, a New York printer. Zenger's newspaper had published articles criticizing the corrupt royal governor of the time, William Cosby. Zenger was charged with seditious libel. Under English law at the time, The truth of the statements was not a defense. In fact, it could make the libel worse. The jury's only job was to determine if Zenger had published the articles, which he had. But Zenger's lawyer, the brilliant Philadelphian Andrew Hamilton, made a radical argument directly to the jury. He argued that they had the right to judge not just the facts, but the law itself, and that speaking the truth about a corrupt government was a fundamental right of free men. Quote, "It is not the cause of one poor printer, nor of New York alone, which you are now trying. No, it may in its consequence affect every free man that lives under a British government on the main of America. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty, the liberty both of exposing and opposing arbitrary power by speaking and writing truth." End quote. The jury, in a bold act of defiance, ignored the judge's instructions and found Zenger not guilty. This trial was a landmark victory for the freedom of the press and the powerful assertion of the colonists' right to challenge authority. While these political and legal battles were being fought in the state houses and courtrooms, a spiritual fire was sweeping through the colonies. This was the Great Awakening, and this was a transatlantic religious revival that emphasized an emotional, personal relationship with God, challenging the formal, staid religion of the established churches of the time. The movement was fueled by itinerant preachers who traveled from town to town, holding massive outdoor revivals. The most famous of these was the English evangelist George Whitefield. He was a superstar. He was probably one of the first superstars, a charismatic preacher whose sermons drew thousands. Nathan Cole, a Connecticut farmer, left a vivid account of the day that he heard Whitefield was coming to preach. Quote, "I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool and ran home to my wife and told her to hurry. My wife and I rode my horse as fast as I thought the horse could bear. When we neared Middleton, I heard a noise like a low rumbling thunder and saw that it was the noise of horses' feet. As I came closer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, all of a lather and foam with sweat. Every horse seemed to go with all his might to carry his rider to hear the news from heaven of the saving of souls." End quote. The messages of preachers like Whitefield and the New England theologian, a man named Jonathan Edwards, was one of the human sinfulness and of the absolute need for God's grace. Edwards had a most famous sermon. You may have heard of it, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and it painted a terrifying picture of the damnation that awaited those who did not repent. Quote, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over a fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder." End quote. The awakening was deeply divisive. It split congregations into new lights who embraced the revival and old lights who condemned its emotional excessiveness. But it also had a powerful unifying effect. This was the first truly intercolonial event. It created possibly the first shared American experience. And by encouraging people to challenge the authority of established ministers and to trust their own experiences, personal experiences of God, historians argue that it fostered a spirit of individualism as well as anti-authoritarianism that would fuel the American Revolution. All of these developments, the growing consumer economy, the deepening of slavery, the awakening of religious and political consciousness were taking place in the shadow of a global rivalry between Britain and France. And in 1754, that rivalry exploded into a full-blown war, a conflict that began in the backcountry of Pennsylvania and would spread across the globe. We call it the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. It just depends on where you live. The war started over competing claims to the Ohio River Valley. Virginia's governor sent a young, ambitious militia officer, you might have heard of him, George Washington, to warn the French to back out of the territory. The mission ended in a skirmish that left the French officer dead, and the first shots of a world war were fired. The early years of the war were a disaster for the British. General Edward Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pittsburgh was ambushed and annihilated. The fighting was often brutal and chaotic. A soldier named Robert Moses describes one battle in his diary. Quote, "The enemy pursued them very boldly with their firelocks shouldered and their bayonets fixed to them, marched in towards the front of our army. The Indians on the left wing were so ambitious that they would fain enter into ye artillery ground. One of which being fired on them swept away 16, which put the rest in such a terror that they drawed off as quick as possible." End quote. The war exposed a deep cultural shift between the professional British Army and the less professional colonial militias. The British officers, being smug, looked down on the colonists as undisciplined provincials, while the colonists, well, they just chafed under the brutal discipline of the British regulars. This friction is clear in a 1757 letter from George Washington to Governor Dinwiddie, complaining that he and his fellow Virginia officers were being denied the rights and respect of British subjects. Quote, "We cannot conceive that being Americans should deprive us of the benefits of British subjects, and we are very certain that no body of regular troops ever before served 3 bloody campaigns without attracting royal notice." End quote. Despite these early struggles, the tide turned in Britain's favor after 1757, thanks to a massive infusion of British money and troops. British forces captured Quebec in French Canada in 1759 and Montreal in 1760, and this effectively ending French power in North America. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, was a stunning victory for the British Empire. France seceded all of Canada and its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. The colonists were ecstatic. They celebrated as Britons, proud to be Britons, proud to be part as British subjects of this victorious Protestant empire against those evil French Catholics. Benjamin Franklin captured the mood. He wrote, quote, "No one can rejoice more sincerely than I do the reduction of Canada, and this not merely as I am a colonist, but as I am a Briton." End quote. But this moment of imperial unity would be short-lived. The war had been enormously expensive for Britain, and it left Britain with a vast new territory to govern, but it also gave them a mountain of debt. The question of who would pay for it and who would control these new lands would shatter the very empire that had just been victorious. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763, and before that ink is dry, a brutal conflict erupted on the frontier. With the French gone, Native American nations in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley found themselves facing a British Empire that was far more arrogant and aggressive than their French allies had been. The British commander Geoffrey Amherst cut off the traditional practice of gift-giving, which was essential to diplomacy, and he treated Native American leaders with contempt. He summed up the prevailing British attitudes when he called Native Americans, quote, the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, end quote. This new reality was not lost on the Native American leaders. In 1763, inspired by the teachings of a Delaware prophet named Neolin, who called for a rejection of European ways, an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac forged a pan-Indian alliance to drive the British out. In a powerful speech, Pontiac laid out his people's grievances, quote, "The English sell us goods twice as dear as the French do, and their goods do not last. When I go to see the English commander and say to him that some of our comrades are dead, instead of bewailing their death, as our French brothers do, he laughs at me and at you. From all of this you can see that they are seeking our ruin. Therefore, my brothers, we must all swear their destruction and wait no longer." End quote. Pontiac's war was a stunning success at first. His forces captured 9 of the 12 British forts west of the Appalachians. The British response was brutal. Emerson famously suggested using smallpox as a biological weapon, ordering his officers to distribute infected blankets to the besieging tribes. The war eventually ended in a stalemate, but it forced the British to rethink their frontier policy. To prevent future conflicts and to control the costs of defending the frontier, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. This royal decree drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and forbade any colonial settlement west of the Appalachian line. It ordered any settlers already there to, quote, "forthwith to remove themselves," end quote. The proclamation, so close to after just the war ending, infuriated the colonists. Land speculators like George Washington, who had invested heavily in Western lands, saw their profits vanish. Ordinary farmers and veterans who had fought in the war felt that they were being denied the spoils of the victory. While intended to pacify Native Americans, the proclamation was seen by many colonists as a tyrannical overreach of the king, a sign that the British government was more interested in controlling the colonists than protecting them. As one historian notes, quote, "It marked the beginning of a clear ideological break with the mother country." And so by 1763, the stage was set for a new and even greater conflict. The 18th century had been seeing the American colonies become more populous, more prosperous, and in many ways more British than they had ever been before. This shared consumer culture, a shared religious awakening, and a shared victory in a global war had tied them to the empire. But these same forces had also sown the seeds of division. The Consumer Revolution created debt and dependence. The Great Awakening fostered a spirit of individualism and a distrust of the established authority. And the 7 Years' War, the moment of greatest imperial triumph, left Britain with a staggering debt and a host of new problems. Their solution, then, would be to tax the colonies and to tighten their control. And this would run headlong into a colonial society that was more confident than ever in its rights and liberties as Englishmen. By 1763, as our textbook notes, colonists felt that they were not being treated as full British subjects, and they saw the new imperial reforms and taxation as direct threats to the very liberties that they believed were their birthright. The victory celebrations had hardly ended when Parliament began to pass a series of new laws designed to make the colonies pay their share. These include the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and we'll get to all of those in the next episode. These weren't, however, just taxes. To the colonists, they were a direct assault on their freedom. Next time on Star-Spangled Studies, the arguments over tea and taxes becomes a battle over liberty and representation. The road to revolution begins, and we'll pick up the road in our next episode. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.